Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Ask the Doctor. We are really pumped today. We're going to learn how to reverse the perfect storm of cancer, which is super important information. And we have the man of the hour, Dr. Bob Rakowski, who teaches, trains, and lectures doctors all over the world. And we are blessed to have him with us tonight. So don't forget to put your questions in the chat so we can answer them at the end. And without any further ado, Dr. Bob.
Well, Carol, thank you always. I realized when I created the cover slide for this, we've done this topic before. I decided to do it again for a number of reasons. I have an absolutely wonderful friend who got a 100% clean bill of health from cancer that had metastasized throughout the body and crushed it. There's no evidence of anything anywhere. I mean, anything out of balance. So from fighting for her life to absolute perfect health, and that's always fun. And there was a breakthrough cancer conference that was virtual. And today I gave a lecture for that. So I thought we might as well go with this topic again. So as we talk about cancer, keep in mind that before the age of 55, the number one fear, at least in the Western world, is cancer. After 55, it's people are afraid of outliving their brain, losing their mind. And so we're going to talk about cancer and what really causes it. You know, that whole idea of nature versus nurture. What if a family member had cancer? What about some of these other cancer genes? So we're going to let you know that genetics are a very tiny component of cancer risk. We'll talk about the evolution of the cancer pandemic because it's essentially man-made. If we go back 150 years ago, cancer was almost not known. 2% of 80-year-olds died of cancer. Of course, prevention trumps cure. So we're going to talk about the recipe to create cancer, and then the opposite of that, the inverse recipe to prevent cancer. And then what if you're behind? What if you've been diagnosed? So that will actually be more of next week's topic because we're going to have quite a bit to share. So it'll be more than one session. I found this to be a fascinating quote from Deepak Chopra, certainly one of the more respected authors and voices in all of healthcare. He's a medically trained doctor. And he said this: more people will live off cancer than will die from it. So think about that. Think about the cancer industry and all the research, 350 plus approved chemotherapeutic drugs. And if I shared the data, we're actually not ahead at all of when Richard Nixon declared the war on cancer in 1971. So we have more people being diagnosed, more people dying, and we're certainly not winning this battle. So the concept of nature versus nurture, I've used this picture before to talk about lifestyle choices. To the left is a picture of Gwyneth Paltrow, and to the right was a picture of her in a basically a fat suit in the movie Shallow Hal. But it would be surprising if people understood how little it takes over time to create either one of those bodies. So you could go from this to this with one extra piece of bread every day for 20 years. That's all it takes, 80 extra calories a day for 20 years. Or maybe just not getting 6 minutes of good exercise a day, again for 20 years. Or what about both? An extra piece of bread and not exercising for 10 years, that could be the difference. Or the inverse is true. Cut back that piece of bread, get 6 intense minutes of exercise, and you can go from there to there in 10 years. So here's the data. And when I share information, PubMed, this is the National Library of Medicine, National Institutes of Health database, where they talk about how much of cancer is considered to be genetic and how much is environment. Remember, cancer is a disease of the genes, but it is not inherited. And genetic risk is only 5 to 10%. 90 to 95% is basically what you do. So diet, top risk, tobacco, certain types of infections. So you want to have a strong immune system, and other toxins all relate to cancer. By the way, obesity is also a major risk factor for cancer. It puts the body in a chronic inflammatory state. But this is a study that really I thought should have been on the front page of every single newspaper. And they said, okay, let's figure out if genes really are, what's going on with cancer. And so they took a normal cell with a normal nucleus, normal genetic material, and then they took a cancer cell with cancer nucleus, and they swapped nucleuses. They put the cancer nucleus in a normal cell body, and then they put the normal nucleus into a cancer cell body. And if it were genetic, we would expect that the cells that got the cancer nucleus would become cancerous. but that didn't happen. The nucleus that went into the toxic cancer environment actually became cancerous. So I say this should have been shouted from every rooftop, but guess what? It went against the common narrative. And therefore, basically, the information just wasn't honored at all. If we realize that the environment sets up cancer is the cause of cancer, then we should be treating the environment and making it healthy, not intoxicating it. So similar, new study came out that guess what? The best immunity for a common virus is to actually get the virus and beat the virus. But that was known about a year and a half ago. So, some epidemiologists said, look, everybody who's healthy should go out and get the virus. And then you'll be over it in 10 days to 2 weeks. And guess what? We protect the healthy people over that period of time, and then this will pass like every other virus. But instead, that didn't happen. So I was at a cancer lecture about 35 years ago. Dean Black walked into a room of 200 doctors, and he asked the question, how does a hurricane start? And the answer he was looking for was a hurricane starts when conditions are just right. He then asked, how does a tornado start? Well, a tornado starts when conditions are just right. How does cancer start? Cancer starts when conditions are just right. And these are the well-defined conditions: low oxygen, low nutrients, high acid, chronic inflammation, and immune suppression, usually secondary to chronic distress. So let's go with low oxygen first. And instead of going cancer and low oxygen, I basically went cancer and no oxygen. So anaerobic means without aerobic metabolism, without oxygen. Almost 3,000 published studies going back nearly 100 years. And this is certainly an environment that sets up cancer. And if we want to get oxygen into the body, we want to increase a molecule called nitric oxide. So this was a Nobel Prize winning research, right? The researcher Farhad Murad, I co-lectured at a conference with him over 20 years ago. We were on the same stage, not at the same time. So co-lectured, co-conference speakers is a more accurate term. But basically, doctors knew for nearly 100 years that there was some nitrogen-containing molecule that was very good at dilating blood vessels. And if you think back to 1970s movies, you might see an angry type male that has kind of a big belly, and he gets himself all worked up, and next thing you know, he's clutching his chest. And then he's reaching around for some kind of magic pill, and he finds that pill and he puts it under his tongue. And then within a few moments, he actually starts breathing easier and he stops clutching his chest. Well, that pill was nitroglycerin. So scientists knew that there was a nitrogen containing molecule. And a team of researchers ultimately figured out that a single dose of nitric oxide can dilate blood vessels by as much as 62%. And there's so many things that nitric oxide is good for. You make more efficient energy, better blood flow, better endurance, better insulin signaling. That means less diabetes, better blood pressure, better cholesterol, better kidney function, better libido and sexual function, decreased damage from toxins like cigarettes, improved cognition, anti-aging. And that's really just the tip of the iceberg. This really is a miracle molecule, great for health. So let's talk about what destroys nitric oxide. And the biggest enemy of nitric oxide is actually inflammation. There's 3 forms of nitric oxide. One form lines your blood vessels. That's called endothelial nitric oxide. One form is in your brain. That's called neuronal nitric oxide. And then we have inflammatory nitric oxide. So when the body's inflamed, nitric oxide can increase by more than 1,000x, not 1,000%, but 1,000x. And so inflammation devours nitric oxide, and it is the top risk factor for cardiovascular disease. So the primary causes of inflammation: trauma, that's usually pretty obvious. If you hit your thumb with a hammer, you know it. Toxicity, that's a little bit insidious, as is nutrient insufficiency. And since malnutrition is going to be a standalone factor alone, we'll talk about toxicity. So we do have a very toxic world. I think most people realize that there are over 80,000 registered toxic chemicals in the body. When I teach detox to doctors, what I show them is this blood graph. And the green bars actually show blood flow at rest. So notice that the liver gets the most blood flow at rest. Second most is kidneys. Third most is brain. So your body's top priority at rest is actually detox. So I mentioned to my students, my philosophy is simple. If detox is the body's top priority, it ought to be our top clinical intervention. So I've recommended intense detox protocols for patients for nearly 30 years. And this is one of those things that can get phenomenal gains in a very short period of time. The World Health Organization says that toxins are responsible for 1/4 of all illness on the planet, 1/4 of all death on the planet. And the symptoms of chronic poisoning include fatigue, sleep disturbance, intestinal distress, allergy symptoms, headaches, confusion, and anxiety. Now, I've said for decades, if these symptoms went away, I would probably have to do something else for a living, because this is what everybody comes to my office with. I also teach doctors and patients that bodies respond to frequency, duration, intensity, quality, and timing of stimuli. So sometimes when I put people on protocols, I have them take certain nutrients every waking hour, because we want to get those fast changes. People want to be better yesterday. They're tired of feeling tired. So a simple metaphor for detox: imagine you're stuck in the mud and someone comes by and says, hey, I'm going to give you a little push. Well, if they give you a push and you hit the gas pedal, you're going to spin your tires and dig a deeper rut. And then you're going to be worse off. So I don't give people a little push. I give them a big push. I give them all the nutrients through functional foods that support detoxification. And I stop them from putting, toxins into their body for anywhere from 7 to 10, or the most I've done is 21 days. Those are very extreme cases with extreme miraculous results. But for people, I recommend 1 week of an intense detox twice per year. They do functional medical foods, organic vegetables, and that's it for the diet. Now, why vegetables? Well, it's very, very simple. As at the top of the food chain, we don't live on dirt, air, and water, but lower level plants and animals that do. So we bioconcentrate the nutrients. That's good, but we also bioconcentrate the toxins, and that's not good. So plants are nowhere near as toxic as animal products. So for that week, we do organic vegetables. We also support the skin, the liver, the intestines, the kidneys, and the lungs. I've taught nutrition around the world now for about 3 decades. And if we go back to about the year 2000, I was lecturing at a conference in Orlando, Florida, and Barry Sears had just finished his book, The Zone. And in that conference, he put up a copy of what was at the time the USDA food pyramid. And his statement was powerful. He said, if ever there was a terrorist-like plot designed to destroy the health of the world, this would be it. And it was the food pyramid with 9 to 11 servings of processed carbohydrates, genetically modified gluten grains at the bottom, something that people shouldn't eat any of for the most part, let alone make it the staple of their diet. So the base of my pyramid is nature's foods. If God made it, it's okay. If man made it, stay away. Then we go to superfoods, functional foods, in this case, that support detox, a good multivitamin mineral, activated omega-3s, probiotics, and a combination of D3, K2. And I've used this pyramid for people that are fighting for their lives and people that are fighting for world championships with tremendous success. Factor number 2, low nutrients. The World Health Organization and the Global Nutrition Report reports that malnutrition is the #1 cause of death on the planet. Every country on planet Earth is affected by malnutrition. And in 2020, it was by far the leading cause of death. About 60% of all deaths on the planet are related to malnutrition. So when we look at nutrition and the immune system, nearly 32,000 PubMed studies going back over 100 years. Here's a simple summary. You need to have optimal nutrition to have optimal immune function. There are 50 essential nutrients, vitamins, minerals, amino acids, proteins, carbohydrates, fat, fiber, and water, and we need them in the right amount for our bodies to experience ideal health. When it comes to diet, I'll let the cat out of the bag. We know that food is too weak to replete depleted cells and bodies, and supplementation is advisable for everybody. That's a quote directly from the journal Advances in Therapy. But when I talk about a diet, if God made it, it's okay. If man made it, stay away. That's a great quote from Jack LaLanne. Michael Pollan said, eat food, not too much, mostly plants. But I'm going to expand on that. Eat real food, not food-like substances, the synthetic stuff that they market as food. Eat clean food, not GMO food, not herbicide, insecticide, fungicide food. Not too much. Calorie restriction is the #1 method of longevity ever studied. And by the way, when you cut back your calories, cells that are energy inefficient die first. And so we know that calorie restriction kills cancer cells and pre-cancer cells. Not too often, same thing with intermittent fasting, over 100,000 medical studies. We probably want to spend more time each day not eating than we spend eating, probably 2 to 1, 16 hours a day of not eating, 8 hours a day eating. Every color, why every color? Every plant and every color has a different balance of nutrients, and all of those are wonderfully nourishing every day, because we need to nourish ourselves every day. And then in a way that honors our physiology, our genetics, and our body goals. And finally, mostly plants is a very good summary there. And so there we have our food pyramid again with nature's foods, superfoods, functional foods. Superfoods, by the way, have all the fabulous 50, all the vitamins, minerals, amino acids, proteins, carbohydrates, fat, fiber, and water, and other things that are powerful for the immune system and anti-cancer. And I'll highlight one of those fairly soon. When we look at cancer and the immune system, 255,000 PubMed studies. And then this graph at the bottom shows it goes back over 100 years, but look at over the last decades. Here's what they found out. The greatest cure for cancer is actually our own immune system. So when they have cancer immune therapies, they're trying to get some kind of drug that helps your immune system kill cancer. Hey, I've got an idea. Why don't we stay healthy? Why don't we prevent the perfect storm of cancer? And why don't we do all the things that we know to do to keep our immune system healthy? One of the enemies of the immune system is stress. And this graphic shows it pretty simple. The immune stress vicious cycle. When you're stressed, you weaken your immune system. A weaker immune system makes you more vulnerable to things, which can make you sick or other things break down. And then that's stressful and you keep on this pattern. So for years, I've also talked about the deadly quartet, things that really kill us: stress, toxins, malnutrition, and physical inactivity. But the medical literature is clear. Everybody has chronic stress, or here's what it said: many, if not all, New World primates have elevated cortisol and cortisol resistance, meaning their stress is so high that the body begins to ignore the stress hormone cortisol. Cortisol is actually life critical. We can't live without it. Cortisol is actually an anti-inflammatory. And as we become cortisol resistant, the body becomes progressively inflamed and the immune system begins to be less effective. I tell people that this is one of my top clinical pearls over the last decade. Melatonin is one of the best stress buffers known to man. The gut, I'll show you in a moment, actually makes 400 times the melatonin as the brain. So when you take melatonin orally, it actually doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier. If it did, you would actually be asleep all day long. Now, if you're running on stress hormones, you take melatonin, you might feel tired. But guess what? It's telling you that your body actually needs rest. This PubMed says melatonin may be good for adrenal insufficiency. That's both parts of the adrenals, the part that deals with chronic stress and the part that deals with acute stress. And another reference there that it puts the brakes on stress. And there's your reference about the gut, 400 times the melatonin as the brain. And since we're talking about cancer, it's one of the most researched anti-cancer molecules out there. This article, The 10 Hallmarks of Cancer, melatonin is a positive modulator of all 10 hallmarks, making it one of the most powerful anti-cancers. So you might notice I'm wearing blue blockers. There's a reason for that. Blue light inhibits melatonin. So we want to protect ourselves from blue light. So I recommend melatonin every waking hour. I also recommend theanine every waking hour. By the way, melatonin is 1 to 2 milligrams, theanine 100 to 200 milligrams. Theanine is from green tea. There's over 1,000 studies on the anti-cancer benefits of green tea, dozens of studies on the anti-cancer benefits of melatonin, but it actually calms stress within the mind. And then finally, reishi, also known as GANODERMA. I'll show you in a moment. There's data that shows that it calms the body, the mind, and the spirit. So I encourage people to look up the PubMeds. Don't take my word for it. This one says GANODERMA calms the body by driving the parasympathetic nervous system. That means it's the rest and recovery and repair system of the body. It calms the mind through GABA facilitation, so it's synergistic with theanine. and then it calms the spirit. And that's very unusual language in the medical literature. It's called the herb of spiritual potency. When you have malnutrition, basically your immune system doesn't work anywhere as well, and you also develop chronic inflammatory process. And while I mentioned GANODERMA, fascinating study out of MIT, there's two major parts of the immune system. One goes directly after the cancer cells. That's actually what's showing here. This is actually a cancer cell. Those are immune cells attacking it. And the other is antibody immunities. And what we know is that GANODERMA enhances the direct attack on cancer. It unwinds the perfect storm of cancer, calms the perfect storm of cancer, reverses the perfect storm of cancer, and even enhances cancer antibodies. So I think it ought to be an automatic in cancer therapies. And we'll show later it enhances the killing effect of chemotherapy while protecting normal cells, enhances the killing effect of radiation while enhancing normal cells. So now we're going to get to high acid. Now in the medical literature, they're going to talk about high acid as being called the Warburg effect. And I'll show you that in a moment. But here's what it says. Altogether, the Warburg effect is the central contributor to cancer progression machinery. Accumulation of lactate, that means lactic acid, which drives tumor progression and tumor acidosis. And by the way, it makes the tumor resistant to chemotherapy and resistant to your own immune system. So we really want to deal with the high acid effect of cancer. So high acid in cancer, through looking at it through the Warburg effect, over 3,000 published studies, again, going back over 70 years. Figure out what happened to my ability to advance my screen here. I think my screen froze. What do I do? Maybe talk so we don't have dead airspace. So the Warburg effect, I think I can get out of that now, maybe. There we go. All right, yay. All right. So notice one of the principal things that happens with the Warburg effect, they actually become anaerobic, low oxygen, non-oxygen, and they burn sugar. Cancer cannot survive without sugar. And then, quite simply, genetic and pharmacological studies show that the Warburg effect is required for tumor growth. So no oxygen, high acid, cancer grows. There's surprisingly little in the medical literature about the alkaline diet. There's a lot more in the alternative medical literature. And I'll tell you that I've been alkalizing patients for nearly 3 decades at this point. But one of the published medical benefits of an alkaline diet reduces tumor cell invasion and metastasis and does enhance response to chemotherapy. And there we get to GANODERMA, the most alkaline food on the planet. Inflammation in cancer, this one gets more press than anything else. Over 410,000 PubMed studies. And quite simply, chronic inflammation is essential for cancer progression. This basically says when the inflammation is excessive, it causes DNA damage, genetic instability, epigenetic dysregulation, meaning your lifestyle choices are no longer as effective. It alters cell signaling, and all of these are involved in cancer. So I tell a funny story about cell signaling because it's the first thing that's lost in cancer progression. When I'm teaching to doctors, I'll point out in the audience, you know, we have a couple hundred doctors here, but we don't see anybody else sitting on anybody else's lap. And the reason is we respect people's space. And when lunch comes around, we don't reach on other people's plates and steal their food. And certainly when we need to use the restroom, we go to some quiet private place away from everybody, and then we use the restroom. But cancer violates all those principles. It's going to steal your food, it's going to crowd all your space, and it's going to poop and pee all over you. So it's going to be a horrible, horrible neighbor, just intoxicating your environment. So we always want to get those cells to go away. What causes the inflammatory process? Trauma, toxicity, nutrient insufficiency. So we have functional foods and anti-inflammatory diets, along with the activated omega-3s are anti-inflammatory, GANODERMA's anti-inflammatory, probiotics can modulate the inflammatory process, as does vitamin D3. And then next week, we'll talk about radical remission. That's winning from behind. That was a lot of science and a lot of data and a little more than usual. And in fact, what I think I'm going to do is I'm actually going to stop the recording.